Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. It's raining, gloomy outside, but it's a great day to come and learn about responsibilities of landlords and tenants. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your Monday to learn about the laws surrounding responsibilities of landlords and tenants. For those of you who know me, you know I'm very active on social media. Head over to our Facebook and Instagram. Like us, follow us. We always tend to give updates and giveaways through our social media. If you have one of these smartphones, you can scan that QR code at the bottom left of the screen and add us in as your contact directly to your contact list. So let's get started. I won't bore you with information about myself, an introduction about myself. Many of you know me already. I will say that for the purpose of this presentation, everything we discuss should be taken as general information and not to be taken as legal advice. If you have any questions, let's hold them to the very end, and then we can do a Q&A, and you can ask me anything that is landlord and tenant related. So let's get started. Let's talk about landlord. We're going to first talk about landlord's responsibilities because, we often receive phone calls when we're dealing with landlord and tenant issues, and we get a wide range of questions that often the landlord puts a certain amount of his responsibilities or her responsibilities and just dumps it onto the tenant. So I want to provide clarity surrounding what exactly is the landlord's responsibility. So per sections 20 to section 32, so there are 12 sections that actually covers the landlord's responsibilities in the Residential Tenancies Act. We're going to go through each and every one of these sections, I'm going to provide examples, and we're going to really discuss what the landlord's responsibilities are, and then we're going to flip over to what the tenant's responsibilities are. So let's talk about section 20. Section 20 and 21 are the most common sections that we refer back to when we're consulting landlords. For the first section, section 20, with respect to repairs and maintenance, it is the landlord's responsibility to maintain and repair the property. And this includes both the inside of the rental property and the outside of the rental property. So maintenance inside the rental unit includes, changing light bulbs. This is really important because changing the light bulbs, often landlords think that if the light bulb is burned out, it's the tenant's responsibility to change it. So no, that's not the case. Changing the light bulbs is a responsibility of the landlord. This property, I always tell my landlords, this is your property. You have to maintain it. You can't purchase real estate and then dump it on a tenant and say, hey, you maintain and repair it out of your own pocket. It doesn't work that way while the landlord is building equity. So it doesn't work that way. So remember, maintenance inside the property. So it's changing the light bulbs, changing the furnace filter. If there's any other filter for a humidifier or dehumidifier, these are repairs and maintenance obligations that the landlord must undertake. Also, repairs and maintenance, pertain to the outside of the property. And grass cutting and snow removal fall under repairs and maintenance. I know that when I'm reviewing leases, often landlords include in their leases that grass cutting and snow removing is the responsibility of the tenant. And that's not the case. Grass cutting and snow removal is the responsibility of the landlord. Now, even if it says that in the lease, there needs to be a contractor's agreement on the side, in addition to the lease, that the landlord is compensating the tenant some sort of something for the tenant to, provide the labor. So there has to be a contractor's agreement. Otherwise, it is the responsibility of the landlord to maintain, and that includes grass cutting and snow removal. So let's move on to section 21, vital services. Now we get, the question we get asked a lot is, with respect to a tenant that's not paying rent, so hey, Bira, my tenant hasn't paid rent for 4 months. They owe me $10,000 or whatever the amount of rent is that they owe. They haven't paid for hydro either. can I cut off the hydro? Can I cut off the heat? And section 21 states that landlords cannot interfere or cut off vital services like heat, water, hydro for any reason. And that includes if the tenant does not pay the rent. Moving on to section 22, interference with the tenant's reasonable enjoyment. So what is interference? Interference is when you rent a property to someone and the landlord is becoming a nuisance. He's, making frequent and unnecessary inspections. Let's talk about what is defined as a frequent inspection. How often can a landlord visit his rental property or the rental property for the purpose of an inspection? First of all, the landlord has to provide notice, okay, for the purpose of an inspection. In that notice, the landlord must specify why they're coming, what is being inspected. Are they changing the smoke detector batteries? Are they replacing the carbon monoxide detectors? Are they checking for cleanliness? Are they checking for disrepair? What are they checking for? Now, frequent inspections, the law doesn't give a number. The law doesn't say that, 4 inspections a year is frequent, or 10 inspections a month is too frequent. The law says that a landlord can inspect the property, that's fine if they have a reason to do so. However, they cannot interfere with the tenant's reasonable enjoyment. So I had a landlord who, for the entire month of April, visited the rental unit 4 times. Is that considered a frequent inspection? Absolutely. Did the tenant allow the landlord in? Absolutely not. That is too frequent of an inspection, unnecessarily. Moving on, let's talk about excessive text messages or emails. We do have, and I have to say, these are a lot of the first-time landlords who are very paranoid, who, often text their tenants or email their tenants too many times for often no reason. Let's move on to section 23. The landlord is responsible not to harass. Again, section 22 is also tied in to section 23. I think they go, in my opinion, they go hand in hand. Frequent and unnecessary inspections can be viewed as a form of harassment. Excessive emails and text messages can be used as evidence as a form of harassment at the board. Landlords must be careful what they put in writing, whether text messages, emails, Facebook, iMessages, anything that you put in writing as a landlord will be used against you at the board. This is a guarantee, because a lot of tenants, and I'll tell you, the professional tenants often look for trying to get a rise out of the landlord, or trying to get the landlord to harass them so that at the board they can spin it. Let's talk about section 24, changing the locks. This is a really important one, because I had a landlord, I'll tell you a little story. I had a landlord say to me that he went for an inspection. He provided the notice. The tenant said that he'll be home within a certain time. The landlord arrived earlier, put the key in the door, put the key in the lock, and the key that he had wasn't working. So he changed the locks. Okay, so if the landlord changes the locks, you're not allowed to change the locks without the tenants knowing. However, if the locks are changed for any reason, and any reason can be, the tenant wasn't home and there was a fire and the landlord needed to get in, they broke the door down, they changed the locks, a key must be provided to the tenant at the expense of the landlord. Remember, anytime you own and operate real estate as a form of, in order to receive rental income, you have to treat it like a business. And in business, we have expenses. And if a landlord is going to change the locks, they have to bear that expense, unfortunately. Failure to change, if the landlord changes the locks and failure to provide a key to the tenant, this can be deemed as an illegal lockout. And illegal lockouts have very hefty and serious cost consequences. So we want to stay away from that. Let's move on to section 25, privacy. Again, I hope you're noticing that some of these sections tie into others, like for section 25, privacy. Frequent and unnecessary inspections, is that a breach of the tenant's to tenants' privacy? Absolutely. If the landlord is coming by every week or every month, and the tenant is trying to have dinner with his or her family, then yes, it's a breach of their privacy. Other issues surrounding privacy, Section 25, is installing video recording cameras especially without posting notices, or installing cameras that face the entrance of the rental unit. These are illegal. A landlord cannot install a camera that faces the inside of the rental unit or picks up the inside of the rental unit. Let's talk about notice. So Section 26 and 27 with respect to entry without and with notice. Let's talk about entry without notice. A landlord can enter a property in the case of an emergency. So what's an emergency? I'll tell you a little story, because we manage a little 12-plex apartment building. And one day we were going to, we had some stuff to pick up, and we arrived at the property, and there was a woman standing outside of the property, all frantic. She ran to our vehicle and she said, Bita, I'm here to visit my friend on the second floor. I can hear that he has the water on, and I can hear from calling him on my cell phone that his cell phone rings, but nobody picks up the phone. And when I look through that, sometimes the doors have those mail slots, the lights are on, the TV's on, and I hear the sound of water. Well, the sound of water going on nonstop is, to me, an emergency, because that can cause serious damage if there's a water leak. So we entered the property, and unfortunately that tenant had passed away on the couch. So not only did we enter the property to turn off the water, we noticed that the tenant had passed away. Number two, the tenant consents to entry at the time of the entry. So if a landlord is doing repairs, and let's say, for example, the tenant walks outside and says, "Hey, Superintendent Bob, I need something replaced." And Bob says, "Well, can I do it now?" And the tenant says, "Yes, of course, come in." That, under Section 26, can be considered entry without notice. Let's talk about entry with notice. Okay, so Section 27. A landlord must provide notice to the tenant if they are going to do either of the five listed. So number one, to carry out a repair or replacement of the work. Number two, to allow a potential mortgagee or insurer to view the rental property. Number three, to allow an engineer or architect to inspect the rental unit. Number four, to carry out an inspection of the rental unit. Or number five, for any reasonable reason for entry specified in the residential tenancy agreement. So whatever is in your lease. For example, this can be the landlord coming in or arranging for a cleaning lady who visits the property once every 6 weeks. If that is specified in the tenancy agreement, that this is the landlord's responsibility, then entry is required. Entry with notice is required. So Section 28, let's talk about entry by canvassers. And when we define canvassers, I don't mean people walking around the rental property, knocking on doors and selling chocolates or newspapers. I'm referring to those people that works for the Elections Canada, or the MPPs or the MPs who are going around knocking on doors. The landlord has to let them in to canvass the rental complex. Section 29, tenant applications. So complaints made by former tenants are allowed to be considered at the board under Section 29 within 12 months from the date that they have moved out. So for example, if I live in a property and I was really unhappy, I moved out, I have 12 months to bring forward a complaint against my former landlord for breach of his or her obligations, harassment, interference. The landlord made me shovel the snow or cut the grass. Now I'm coming after him for compensation. These are allowed under Section 29 of the Act. Section 30, with respect to order, repair, and compliance. Let's talk about that. This is really interesting, because if the board determines that there is a breach of the landlord's obligation, then the board can order certain remedies to the tenant under this section. So What can they order to the tenant? They can order a termination of tenancy if the tenant is seeking to exit their lease earlier than the termination date, a rent abatement. The board can authorize a repair within a certain time period. The board can order the landlord to pay a fine. The board can even freeze the rent increase. So this is really important because I'll give you an example of this one. I had a client, a tenant client who rented a brand new condo. And he said, we had carpet and then there was a leak and then the carpet was all pulled up and now the flooring is all concrete. So we don't want to live here anymore. We moved in 2 months ago. We're still within our lease, but now we're living on concrete. Now, I understand that the landlord often does not have control over new builds. However, that doesn't matter when it goes to the board. The board doesn't see the fact that the landlord is relying on the builder. The board sees that the landlord must provide a safe and habitable unit for the tenant to live in. And they can actually put an order in with respect to Section 30 and either terminate the tenancy or require that repair. So that landlord, doesn't matter if it's the builder, that landlord has to make sure that there's carpeting or something there temporarily. So this is really important. Just remind your clients who are purchasing new builds, especially new build condos, that even though some repairs or some renovations are not in their hands, that they are responsible because they're responsible for their tenant. Section 31, other orders regarding Section 29. So what does this mean? This means that if the landlord, not only the landlord, but if the landlord's agents or employees or contractors are at fault, the board can still hold the landlord financially responsible because their agents, their employees, their contractors are working for the landlord. So the board can order remedies under Section 31 regarding Section 29. Section 32 of the Act states that with respect to eviction with a termination order. Let's talk about this because the landlord and tenant board can order an eviction if the landlord is in breach of the responsibilities and if the tenant does not move out in order for the landlord to remedy the issue. So I'll give an example. So the landlord is in breach of his maintenance obligations. Let's say, for example, there was asbestos that was in the property that was affecting the breathing of the tenant. The board ordered that this be removed, the asbestos to be removed, and the tenant obviously could not live there during the time of this removal. The landlord would actually have to come back to the board and state that the board has issued an order. However, the tenant is not moving out. So the board can actually order an eviction if the landlord is in breach of his responsibilities, if the tenant doesn't move out in order for the landlord to remedy the issue. So we've talked about the landlord's responsibilities. Let's talk about the tenant's responsibilities. So under Section 33 to Section 36 of the Residential Tenancies Act, it outlines the tenant's responsibilities. So the first thing you're probably thinking is, why does the landlord have a list of 12 things that he or she has to be responsible for, but the landlord only has 3 or 4? How is this fair? Well, I'll tell you, the law is there to balance all sides, balance the landlord and balance the tenant. However, the property still belongs to the landlord. I always tell my clients, this is your property. You have to take care of it. Please treat it like a business, okay? The customer is responsible for very little, while you, the property owner, are responsible. You have a list of responsibilities. So let's shift positions here and talk about the tenant's responsibilities. Section 33, the tenant is responsible for cleanliness. Let's talk about cleanliness because when it comes to cleanliness, everybody has their own definition because everybody's definition of cleanliness is different. My definition of cleanliness is different than Tina's definition of cleanliness. The tenant is responsible for ordinary cleanliness of the rental unit, except to the extent that the tenancy agreement requires the landlord to clean it. So The tenant is responsible to keep the property clean, ordinary cleanliness. However, remember the term ordinary cleanliness is very vague, except if the landlord actually has it in their lease agreement that the landlord will be providing a cleaning lady every 3 weeks or every 4 weeks or every month. Then the tenant is not responsible for ordinary cleanliness. Now, I'll tell you, there are a handful of landlords that do this, have a cleaning lady go in every month or every 2 months because they want to take care of their property. This is, I mean, it's a good thing. Section 34, repair of damage. So many leases that I review, they have a certain clause in the lease that says the tenant is responsible for the first, for repairs or damages up to $50 or repair or damages up to $100. Now, this clause should not be in the lease because the tenant is actually responsible for the repair of undue damage to the property. It doesn't matter if it's $50 or $100 if it's caused by the willful or negligent conduct of the tenant, their guest or occupant, or another person permitted in the complex by the tenant. So if it's damage caused by the tenant or their guest or their visitor or someone else living in there, like an occupant, then the tenant is responsible. Changing the locks. So if you remember the landlord's obligations, when the landlord changes the locks, they have to provide the tenant with the key. Now, on the flip side, the tenant shall not alter the locking system of a property. So if the tenant is going to change the locks for whatever reason, they can bear that expense, and they must provide a key to the landlord if the locks are changed. If they don't do so, the landlord can bring an application to the landlord and tenant board and have the board order the tenant to provide a key to the landlord. Let's move on to section 36. As you know, as we have harassment on the landlord side, we have harassment on the tenant side as well. So section 36 is a tenant is responsible not to harass, obstruct, coerce, threaten, interfere with the landlord. Often we have, tenants that are very angry, or they have some issues, they don't get along with the landlord. They threaten or coerce the landlord, or provoke them. This is a violation of section 36. Let's talk about the lease. Okay, because I've mentioned throughout the presentation that even if there are some things specified in the lease, a party cannot agree to giving up their right and have the lease be valid, because giving up a right, the law takes over giving up a right. So you cannot change any of these responsibilities by having the tenant voluntarily agree to it or voluntarily sign to it. If you include these conditions in a lease agreement that actually contradict or contrary to the law or contradict these responsibilities, these terms and conditions are invalid and unenforceable. So we have, some of the realtors that think they're so smart that as long as we get the tenant to voluntarily provide or voluntarily agree, that this is okay. And no, it's not okay, because you can't get someone to voluntarily give up their right in fear of not getting accepted for that lease or for that property. So again, any clauses or any terms drafted in the lease that are contrary to the act, that contradict the landlord or tenant's responsibilities, are automatically invalid, unenforceable, and void, even if they were agreed to at the time. So we are coming close to the end of the presentation. I hope I gave you a good glimpse of what the landlord's responsibilities are and what the tenant's responsibilities are. I highly recommend that you head over to landlordmastery.ca. We don't sell anything. I always give away our materials. This gives you access to our Google Drive, where Rob uploads materials and updates it regularly. You have access to the new Ontario Standard Lease, which is effective March of 2021. You can download that. There's a blank notice of entry that you can use, scripts, forms, and you can also forward it to your clients. It's beneficial for them, and it'll help them in their business.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like our video, please hit the like button, the subscribe, and even the little bell to get notifications, just so you can stay in touch and watch more of these great videos.